I'm delighted to welcome you to this presentation on Value of Welshness 4. This comes to you on behalf of the Welsh Government's Insight Programme. I'm Donald Webb and I'm joined by Sophie Cahoon and Anne Harrod Butler to take you through the presentation. And don't forget that the presentation will be available for you on the Insight Hub on the Welsh Government's Food and Drink website. If you haven't signed up to that, then please do, and you can get access to all of the insight available through the Insight programme. Today's research focuses on the out-of-home sector, and you can see from the top chart here the size of the take-home sector, that's retail in blue, and below it the size of the out-of-home sector in green. And then the chart below, which shows the percentage change year on year, which is currently in growth. We can see from this chart that in the latest data, combined take home and out of home reached 11.1 billion. And that is almost back to pre-COVID levels, where in March 2020, we saw 11.4 billion. And that did include a bit of first lockdown panic buying. So the sector as a whole is more or less back to where it was pre-COVID, and the latest growth year on year was 11%. Now, it is worth explaining how this research Value of Welshness 4 fits in, and why are we focusing on the out-of-home sector? The Value of Welshness research started back in 2017, and that was a seminal piece of research understanding consumer preference for Welsh products. In other words, if you say to a Welsh consumer, would you rather have a Welsh product or a non-Welsh product? Invariably, about 80% of consumers will say, I would rather have a Welsh product. Then in the following year, Value of Welshness 2, we moved on to understand the in-store experience and why Welshness was not pushing through in many retail stores, and the success factors for Welshness to really push through in-store and get consumers out of the autopilot that they would typically shop in. So that was Value of Welshness 2. Then in 2020, we undertook Value of Welshness 3, which was understanding consumer views on Welshness, particularly those from out with Wales. And we looked at consumer perceptions and how Welsh producers can maximise Welshness through the use of language, branding, and how that changes for different types of product. And that then brings us to Value of Welshness 4 that we're considering today. This latest research then focuses on the out-of-home sector, and it has messages for both guests or customers and the trade itself. The research was undertaken in summer 2021, and it includes consumer research of 1,400 consumers, that's 1,000 in England, 400 in Wales, a street survey in different locations across Wales, a telephone survey of 200 in the trade, and a menu audit with 70 outlets. In addition to these elements, we also are currently trialling Young Pingo in 3 pubs. Now, Young Pingo is a live management for guest experience, so you can actually start a conversation with your customers. And we're running this trial with results to follow and the ability to ask and change the questions of consumers who are live in venue. So today then, we're going to take you through the results of Value of Welshness 4. And we've got 3 main headings. The first of these is really an aside, which I'll mention in a moment, and that's to do with affinity to Wales amongst consumers. Then Sophie is going to take us through eating and drinking, out of home. And lastly, Anne Harrod will take us through public sector sourcing lessons, which were also included in the survey, and a final summary of the work. So let's start then with this point that we picked up on affinity to Wales. And this was an interesting aspect, and say it's a slight aside to the research, But we actually found there's a strong affinity with 24% of consumers in our survey in England saying that they have a strong affinity to Wales. And when they come on holiday to Wales, as many of them do, they want Welshness. They want to feel Welsh. They want to see Welshness in the out-of-home setting. And that's an important initial finding, to understand that affinity to Wales that many English visitors feel partly Welsh. So what about eating and drinking out in Wales? Now, it's important to understand the consumer, and part of the Insight programme's previous work has been to develop segmentation of consumers. And if you're not aware of this work, it's really, really important that you find out about it. It's on the Insight Hub. Sophie can give more detail on it, but we identified 6 consumer types, from the traditionalists on the right-hand side through ethical, healthy and food lovers to adventurers on the left-hand side. And so the results that we are presenting today will allow us to say whether these groups are over or under indexing. And Sophie will make reference to that as we go through the presentation. So if you hear any of these terms, you'll understand what we're referring to when we talk about the 6 different attitudinal types within the segmentation. So we're going to start then, if we can have the next slide, looking at, in terms of the venue types visited, 9 key questions that we want to answer today. The first of these, how much Welsh food and drink was available in venue? Who visits venues that have got a particularly strong offer? Is it important for Welsh venues to offer Welsh food and drink? Would guests like more Welsh food and drink? Should venues promote it? Should Welsh language be used more? Will guests pay more? That's, if you like, the $1 million question. And then, will having a good Welsh food and drink range attract more guests? And lastly, what is stopping businesses stocking more Welsh food and drink? So I'm going to hand over to Sophie now, who's going to take us through the key results in eating and drinking out of home. Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks very much, Donald. And it's really exciting actually to be here talking about value of Welshness again. And this is the first really big piece we've done in out of home. So it's that exciting, really. I'm going to be really summarising things around 3 areas. So, you know, what are the venue types and who visits them? Do guests want more Welsh food, want Welsh food and drink? And do they want more Welsh? And the business end really is, what are the commercial benefits for venues, and are there any? And I think today we're going to highlight some really great arguments for building Welshness within Wales. And Angharad will talk about the last bit on here about what's stopping business, stocking more Welsh food and drink, and then go on to talk about the public sector. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the structure of food service in Wales versus GB. And you can see here, the structure is laid out by Kantar, goes from hotels, pubs, full service restaurants, quick service restaurants. That means McDonald's, KFC, fish and chip shops, vending, workplace and education, coffee shops, bakery, high street, all the way down to major multiples, where they might be selling a sandwich out of a major multiples that's taken out and then eaten outside of a home. So anything that's eaten outside of a home is captured in the way that they structure the market. And Wales actually is a little bit different to the rest of GB, and there are 2 distinct differences. Firstly, Wales has many more hotels and pubs, or share of the spend is much more through hotels and pubs. Nearly a quarter of the spend goes through those avenues in Wales, which is much less, which is much more than GB. And also the other big difference is we've got much less sold through multiples, as in like major multiples with cafes and stuff, significantly less. So what about our survey then? So when we look at where people shop or where people visited, the place that they went most was restaurants and gastropubs, followed by casual dining, followed by bars, followed by coffee shops, followed by quick service restaurants, followed by bakery, and finally by hotels. So sort of that sort of order in terms of where guests visited. The bit I find interesting about this chart, though, however, is going back to that whole piece about guest types and who under and over indexes with each one of these sort of venue types. And I suppose it's unsurprising that adventurers, food lovers and ethical eaters are much more likely to be eating in restaurant, or more likely to eat in restaurants and gastropubs than some other types of venue. And then I suppose it's also not surprising that busy lifestyle people and traditionalists are more likely to be eating in quick serve restaurants or KFCs or McDonald's or fish and chip shops than other places. Although from a traditionalist point of view, they're also, the place they go most is actually bars and pubs. So what this enables us to do firstly is to look at, where our shopper types are more likely to over-index. So food lovers and adventurers are more likely to be going to gastropubs and restaurants, and busy lifestyle guests are more likely to be going to quick service restaurants and coffee shops. And if we're producers, that's quite important, because if we know that our product is targeted towards, say, an adventurer or food lover, then the first venues we might want to go and sell to would obviously be gastropubs and restaurants. So targeting the right product with the right venue type based on your understanding of the right shopper or guest type in this case. So if we're a discovery beer, we might be targeting an adventurer guest type. And then we go to our first protocol might well be a gastropub. So I think this sort of information is very useful for us in terms of targeting. The first question I really want to answer though is how much Welsh food and drink was available. And on average, guests said 8 out of 10 venues put some Welsh food and drink on the menu, and 7 out of 10 businesses said there was some Welsh food and drink on the menu. When we did the pub menu analysis though, we actually only found 5 out of 10 pubs putting some Welsh on their menu, on their advertise on their websites. And that's quite interesting, because then there's a big promotion gap here. And that's the first of what I'm going to call these gaps. And we're going to see a few of them as we go through. And the first big gap that we need to be talking to venues about is promoting Welshness, because there is a perception versus reality of what's happening. If we then look at that broken down sort of between food and then drink, if we look at food, 8 out of 10 guests said they saw some Welsh, as we saw on the first slide. But actually only 13% said they saw lots of menus with lots of menu items with Welsh ingredients. So there's a really big opportunity to get more venues stocking more items with Welsh ingredients. A big opportunity. And the other thing that was quite interesting, 7 out of 10 of businesses claim to use some Welsh. But when you look at that broken down again, regional chains and independents are much more likely to be supporting Welsh than national chains. Again, a significant opportunity. If you then look at that, by different channel type or different outlet type, then again, I suppose no surprises really here. So if you look at bakery and sandwich shops, they're much more likely to be stocking products with lots of Welsh ingredients, as are restaurants and gastropubs. Again, I wouldn't have thought that's a big surprise. And then if we look at quick service restaurants, much less likely to be using lots of menu items with Welsh ingredients. So again, not much surprise, but good to see some of these numbers come out and see what the really big differences are. If we think about that from a Welsh drinks point of view, then Welsh drinks very similar to Welsh food, but it's just slightly less. So the profile is very similar, so slightly less Welsh drink found than Welsh menu items with Welsh ingredients, and significantly less in the sort of the world of lots of. So it's only 7% actually had lots of Welsh drinks, whereas about 13% had lots of Welsh ingredients in the food side. So that's quite a significant difference. And it's 6 out of 10 businesses claim to stock Welsh soft beverages versus 7 out of 10 claim to use Welsh food in their menus. And of course, when you're talking about beers, wines and spirits, it's going to be lower because a lot of the venues don't have alcohol licenses. And then if we're talking about advertising and the menu analysis that we did across 70 different pubs across 14 different regions, you can see that 54% say they should highlight, well, we found 54% of menus had any Welsh on the menu. But actually the big number for me is this at the bottom, which is only 14% advertise both Welsh food and drink. So there is a massive promotion gap here that we sort of were talking about, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. So the next question is, who visits venues with a strong Welsh food and drink offer? Which guest type goes to the venues with a strong Welsh food and drink offer? Well, I suppose, again, I'm not surprised here. If we look at this, both adventurers and food lovers and ethical eaters are much more likely to be going to venues with much stronger Welsh food, with a stronger Welsh food and drink offer. And it's nearly half for food lovers and adventurers where they pick restaurants or pick venues where they have a strong offer. So for these groups, it's probably an active choice. If Welshness is on the menu, then they're much more likely to be attending. And from a traditionalist point of view, then almost the converse is true. That 35% of traditionalists currently go to venues where there are no Welsh menu items and with any ingredients. And if we look at drinks, this scenario is very similar. In the case of traditionalists, it's nearly 4 out of 10 go to venues with no Welsh drinks. But what's interesting for me is this busy lifestyle bit here. It's a little bit of an anomaly because actually the sample size was low in this case for busy lifestyle. So I wouldn't take that. I'd take that with a bit of a pinch of salt. So who visits? Really? We're seeing traditionalists less likely to visit venues with a Welsh offer, and food lovers and adventurers much more likely to visit a venue with a strong Welsh offer. And for them, it could be a choice factor, which I think is a really important consideration if you're a restaurant or a venue that are attracting those types of guests. So the next question is it important for Welsh venues to offer Welsh food and drink? And if so, why? Well, if you went to Taste Wales, you'll probably know some of these numbers already. But 90% of guests think it's important that venues have a good range of dishes with Welsh ingredients. That's a massive number. And 80% of guests think it's important that venues have a good range of Welsh drinks. Still a massive number. And then if you ask businesses and venues, actually only 2/3 of them say it's important to have a good range of Welsh food and drink. And for me, that's what I'm going to call the guest need gap. And it's something I think we should all be focusing on, is this idea of a guest need gap, what guests want and what businesses aren't necessarily delivering. And how we try and address that is how we help businesses give guests what they want. And if you look at the business number, it's 66% in total, or 2/3 say it's important. But of course, when you look at QSRs or quick service restaurants, it's only about 30% say it's important, versus pubs, British cuisine pubs are about 80%. So obviously there's a big spectrum here, but actually what's interesting is it important to all our shopper groups or guest groups about the importance of having a Welsh food and drink offer? Because if it is, then there's an even bigger opportunity in that QSR sector. So if we look at food and drink, the numbers are pretty similar. It's 9 out of 10 for food and 8 out of 10 for drinks. So pretty similar. Say it's important to have a good selection of dishes or drinks made from Welsh food or drink. And it's especially important from all the stuff we've seen so far for adventurers, food lovers, and ethical eaters. But actually, for traditionalists, the number is still 7 out of 10 think it's important to offer a good selection of dishes. And if they're shopping or if they're going to venues that are currently not doing or not providing a lot of Welsh food and drink, there is a big opportunity to give them more of what they want. And is it becoming more important? Well, in 2017, 77% of people said it was important to offer a great range of dishes made with Welsh ingredients. And that number this year has moved to 90%. That is a significant difference. It's really significant. 90% now versus 77 in 2017. And CGA, who do our on-trade piece for on-trade drinks, did a survey this year, and they reckon that 26% of people are buying more local drinks this year. So we're seeing whichever data source we're looking at, we're seeing the importance of localism and the importance of Welshness increasing. And why? Well, from a Welsh guest point of view, they talk about supporting the local economy. They talk about farming. They talk about fresher. They talk about better for the environment. And if it's about England and Scotland, again, it's about supporting local, the economy, farming, but also about enhancing my experience. So if a venue has any visitors from England or Scotland, they really need to be doing Welshness because it enhances their experience. And anybody who runs venues will tell you that experience is a really big factor about why guests choose to come to that venue. And of course, the last reason is fresher, similar to in Wales. So our next question is, would guests like more Welsh food and drink? And 8 out of 10 want more Welsh included in the menu. And if you look at the categories, they're pretty similar, whether you look at England and Scotland, English and Scottish visitors, or Welsh guests. And it's bakery, meat, dairy, beers, wines and spirits, fruit and veg. Those are the top 5. They just slightly alter the order if it's Welsh guests. But it doesn't mean that all other categories aren't important, because they are. Because even if you get to somewhere like confectionery, still 3 out of 10 people say that Welsh confectionery is important in out of home, for instance. So or they want more Welsh confectionery when they buy things outside of the home, whether that's in a venue eating or even from even for their food on the go. And the last question, which I suppose is interesting, is, let's look at our guest types again. So 8 out of 10, we know that, would like more Welsh on the menu. But actually, that's pretty across the board. Even traditionalists who are potentially the attitudinal type that we think would be less likely to wanting a lot of Welsh, even 7 out of 10 would like more Welsh items on the menu. And then what about promoting Welsh or using Welsh in venues? Should venues promote Welsh food and drink, and should Welsh language be used in more venues? Well, nearly everybody says, actually, Welsh should be promoted in venues. If we've got Welsh, please tell us it's Welsh. Please tell us about it, because actually that's really a positive affirmation about the venue for me. 7 out of 10 say they've seen some Welsh when they go into a venue. 44% of businesses claim to highlight Welsh. There's a big disparity there between what guests see and what businesses claim to highlight. And that is probably, again, something to do with a promotion gap. And then lastly, only 14% of businesses actually on their menus online promote the fact that they have Welsh food and drink in their venue, which is this huge opportunity gap from promotion. And as I was saying, so something like 54% have any Welsh, 40-odd% have some Welsh ingredients in their dishes, 23% offer some Welsh drinks, and only 14% offer both Welsh and food and drink on their menus when people are looking to where they should go through TripAdvisor. And that just highlights this idea of promotion gap. And what about the Welsh language? So from a Welsh language point of view, 4 out of 10 say they saw or heard some Welsh language when they were in venues. Less Welsh people, actually, only 2 in 10, which is interesting. And then how many would like to see more Welsh language used? About half of people say that. And now I really want to get to the really business end of this presentation, really. Will guests pay more? Because that's the question we always get asked by venues. We know they want more, but will they actually pay more? And what does it mean for me commercially? That's what venues think about. So the first question is will guests pay more for Welsh food and drink? And for half of guests, that's half of guests, will pay more for Welsh food and drink. That is a big number. And on average, and I'll go into this in a second, it's about £2.80. And what about guests paying more for a pint? 40% would pay more for a pint, or £1.10 more. Again, 40% is a big number. So from a food point of view, it was 50% said yes, I would pay more for a Welsh food and drink. A quarter said no, and a quarter said not sure. So the most people went for was actually I'd pay £3 more, but quite a lot said, quite a few, certainly from Wales, who might spend a little bit less. Only 40% said I only want to pay £1 more. And from a drinks point of view, it's slightly less strong, but still 4 out of 10 said, yes, I would pay more for a pint. And we asked the question specifically around pints, pay more for a pint. A third said, no, we wouldn't. And a quarter said, not sure. And if you're talking about visitors, yes, they're more likely to spend £1. And in Wales, potentially we're more likely to spend 50p more for a Welsh pint. But for me, this is a really big point. It means that 4 out of 10 guests will pay more for a drink, or 5 out of 10 guests will pay more for a dish. So if you offer a choice, that doesn't mean your whole menu has to be Welsh. If you offer a choice, you've got a real opportunity, if you're a venue, to trade people up, to get them to spend a little bit more because they're offering them something else that they want in your venue, which is a Welsh product or a Welsh menu item. And this commercially is significant, I think, for every venue in Wales, really significant. And the last bit of my section really is about, what will having a good range mean for guest trial and loyalty? And this is really crucial. Does offering more Welsh mean that guests are more likely to try or come back to my venue? That's what venues are interesting is, what does Welshness do for me? How does it add value to my business? And secondly, I suppose the converse of this is, what happens if I don't have a Welsh range? And 3/4 of guests are much more likely to visit if there's a good Welsh range. That is a massive number. 3/4 of guests are more likely to visit if there's a good Welsh range. But almost the opposite to that, and if I was a venue, be much more worried about, is 1/4 of guests are less likely to visit if there's no Welsh range, i.e. you could be turning people off if you don't offer Welsh. And that is really quite a significant number. And of course it varies a bit by our guest types. So if we're an ethical eater, Welshness is almost a must. 4 out of 10 people would be turned away if you didn't offer a Welsh range. If you're a busy lifestyle, and all these are about 1/4 of people are saying, actually, it's really important to me, or 1/4 to 1/3. What's interesting for me is the traditionalist piece. So it's only 14% say they won't come if there's no Welsh range, but that's still 1 in 7 guests. That's a significant number. And if I think about this commercially, and I could say, okay, what would happen if we could get 5% more visitors a year because we're offering a better range that actually our guests want? The impact would be absolutely massive. So there is a really strong commercial argument for venues to deliver more Welshness within their menus and also within their drinks menus. And it's not just about the range, because it's not just about one product, it's about a range of products. And it's also about the big promotion gap that we talked about. And if both the range and the promotion bit are sorted, then potentially I think there's a loyalty piece here for venues, which I think is a really good commercial argument for adding Welshness and demonstrating the value of Welshness. So I just want to hand over to Angharad, who's going to talk about what's stopping businesses stopping more Welsh and Welshness in the public sector.
Thanks, Sophie. So Sophie's clearly shown how important it is for guests to be offered a Welsh range. But what's holding venues back? I think reassuringly for producers, 28% of venues said that nothing's preventing them from offering more Welsh. So this is really a case of convincing venues that there's a compelling reason to source Welsh. So it's demonstrating the value of Welshness adds and the evidence that we've gathered through our survey. The second main reason given was that centrally controlled menus and that sort of flexibility of offering Welsh. So sort of really showing that centrally controlled menus aren't really taking advantage of the strength of local to drive footfall and to increase loyalty. And we've seen this sort of change in the retail sector. So there's clearly a role here for it in the out-of-home sector. The third main reason given is about the sort of distribution route and the availability of Welshness, mainly through the big wholesalers. And here I think there's sort of the trade programme in particular are working with the wholesalers to increase range and the visibility of Welsh through this route. And the final main reason given was this issue of price, which kind of comes off often in surveys. But when we think about sort of pricing here, what we're talking about is providing guests the choice. And I think the points that Sophie was making about sort of 50% of food guests and 40% of drinks guests wanting or willing to trade up with that Welsh offer, I think sort of the messaging around pricing needs to be confirmed. So there are opportunities that shouldn't be missed, and Welshness clearly adds value to the out-of-home. And much more can be done to capitalise on this USP and address that guest need gap that Sophie was talking about. Right, my final section that we're going to talk about is to briefly review the attitudes about the public sector sourcing. And here we're focused on those survey respondents who've had experience of public sector food and drink. So in terms of the results, I think it was quite interesting to see that 6 out of 10 people think that there is already quite a lot of food and drink in the public sector. Sorry, can we move on? Sorry, Sophie. Thanks. But 9 out of 10 people think that schools should provide more Welsh. And in terms of net positive scores, so this is kind of taking out those people who weren't sure and those people who said no, so net positives, 4 out of 10 think that councils should pay more for Welsh. And I think there's an interesting question as to why. Why do we have such high percentages of people wanting more Welsh in the public sector? We need to move on. And the reasons are the same for the general out of home. People are focusing on key arguments about supporting the local economy, supporting farmers, so the whole kind of themes around the circular economy. And the second main driver is about sort of being better for the environment and feeling healthier and fresher. And those categories that are closest to raw materials and land-based economy are the most obvious choices for people in terms of what they expect to see in the public sector. So more dairy, more Welsh veg, more Welsh meat, and more Welsh baked goods. So it's kind of, it's nice that so many people are very positive to see Welsh food and drink in the public sector. But I think there's an interesting question about how committed people are to seeing more Welsh. And I think it's sort of quite telling that nearly half said that more Welsh products should be sourced for the public sector, even if it was slightly more expensive. So those drivers around being better for the local economy and better for the environment, really overriding that sort of price sensitivity, with nearly 90% of those saying yes, even though it might cost the taxpayer more. So in overall conclusion for this whole presentation, what have we understood from Welshness in the out-of-home market? And I think before I kind of go through these main points, I think it's really important to remember when we look at these sort of huge percentages that we're seeing, that this was a very sizable survey of 1,400 guests. So firstly, we need to see sort of availability improve. Just under half of guests saying that there was a fair amount of Welsh, and 20% of all guests saying that there was no Welsh availability in venues. 9 out of 10 guests say that it's important for venues to have a good range of Welsh dishes, and 8 out of 10, 80% think that it's important to have a good range of Welsh drinks. Again, 8 out of 10 want more. It enhances their experience. And 90% think that venues should promote it. Yet only half of the most popular venues have any Welsh on menus. Only 38% use the Welsh language, and yet 46, or nearly half, of guests want to see more of it. And then, the business end of it, half of guests would pay more for Welsh dishes, with the average paying an extra £2.80, and 39% would pay more for Welsh drinks, with an uplift of £1.10 for a pint of beer. I think for a sort of a whopping 3/4, having Welsh on menu makes them more likely to visit. And worryingly, a quarter are actively discouraged from the lack of Welshness on menus. In terms of what's stopping more Welsh on menus, this business perception about the value of Welshness and what it brings, issues around central decision making, availability through the wholesaler, and price are the main barriers. 9 out of 10 people believe that the public sector should source more Welsh, and driven by this benefit of the local economy and the environment. So I think in conclusion, there's a sort of fundamental gap between what Welsh venues think guests want and what they actually want. We're really underselling Welsh here. And I think if we close this gap, there's a major sales opportunity for venues, wholesalers, and producers, a real win-win for all in the sector. Thank you very much. I think we're open for any questions.
Well, thank you, guys. Thank you very much for being here today, everybody. And we're very happy to take questions from you now. Has anyone got a question that they'd like to raise? I think you've probably seen in the chat, somebody was asking about the availability of the presentation. You do have to sign up to the members area on the Welsh Food and Drink website. And if you do that, you get access to all of the insight available from the Insight programme. So please do that. That's where the presentation will be following today. So have we got any comments or questions from anybody who's in the room? I think we take silence as good, do we?
Hope so.
Hang on, guys. I have a question. It's Rhys at Gwerth here.
Harry's.
How are we doing? I have a question about, I'm not sure if it's directly linked to this, but for example, the Health and Wellbeing Act for Wales, a lot of the government contracts and things like that, how do you have any sort of insights on how to leverage that into sort of getting that into certain accounts? Because I know that, for example, I was dealing with Conwy Theatre up in North Wales a while ago, and they had a good range of products, but hardly anything from Wales. And I brought this to the attention of them, but I felt a bit sort of like cumbersome chucking all of this stuff in on them, saying, look, you should be stocking Welsh products to commit to you as a public entity. You should be stocking these products because of this act. That's meant to be what you're striving for. But how is there a smaller, more delicately packaged way I can then use that to get into more public sites, basically?
Can I go just hi Rhys? I think I think you're talking about the Future Wellbeing Generations
That's the one.
Act.
That's the one. You know,
which is all about sort of, and it really kind of resonates with the survey results that we had in terms of, why do people want to see more Welsh in the public sector in particular? And it's about sort of being seen to support the local economy. So they feel that they're paying taxes. It's to sort of, so I think there's a strong link between the Future Generations Act in terms of the sustainable economies, and also this view that the public have in terms of how important Welsh is as a sort of a symbol of supporting that local employment and economy and the farming industries. I don't think I've said it any more succinctly than you, but it is a real driver that's sort of behind some of the why people want to see more Welsh.
But I find like a lot of because I want to get into more public account, public sites, but I don't feel as if I've got the information in an easily digestible way to pass on to these retail managers at these sites. That look, not only should you do it because it's a good thing to do, but because it's because you're a government or a public funded building, you should be doing it. So is there some way of or with a cluster or some other way of like packaging some information together to easily fire across some bullet points to help guide these buyers, these retail managers, to getting our Welsh products in?
So I think the other angle on this is actually using this research, because actually this says guests want it, and if they're people who are going to these venues want it, then most of these people they normally have, even if it's a government venue, they normally have sales targets or revenue targets. So therefore we can help prove that we're likely to sell more as a result of doing that, which is what this is about. Then I think some of the evidence that we've shown today is compelling in both in public sector and in any other venue that you've got. So I think I'd do that and then say, and by the way, it helps you meet your future and wellbeing goals. So it's like an at plus, not the sole reason for doing it. The first reason for doing it is because of guests, and we've got all the evidence now, which you'll get a copy of this presentation, and then you can take the 3 or 4 slides you need out of that to go bang, bang, bang.
Joel.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rhys. And I think, there is the carrot and stick approach, and today is very firmly really about the carrot approach, in the sense that I think there'll be a lot of venues that have never really thought about the opportunity. And part of this, as Sophie says, is to raise awareness of the opportunity. And that's certainly what we found in the earlier Value of Welshness research that we've done, going right back to Value of Welshness 1, which was a seminal piece, which actually said Welsh consumers prefer Welsh, and the retailers weren't so sure at that time. And since then, many retailer conversations have happened which have led to Welsh businesses being able to sell more marked Welsh product into the retail sector. Have we got further questions? Yes, we've got a hand up here, Carrie.
Yeah, hi, it's Carrie here from Ynghylch Cymru up in North Wales. Yeah, fascinating research and really encouraging. I was interested about as well about the Welsh language element, and I think you said it was slightly less than half wanted more Welsh language, which then does that mean then that slightly more than half don't want Welsh language, or is it that it was unsure, you know? That'd be the one question, and then going on from then, so just a couple of comments, and are there any, would you know, sort of feel there'd probably be some regional differences in Wales about this anyway, and then does it really depend how it's done, you know, whether there's a little bit of Welsh included or whether it's sort of dominant Welsh? I mean, I think there's sort of subtle ways of doing this where it can be, you know, a sort of positive thing, but without being sort of overwhelming.
Shall I take that? I think that you make really good points. I'm going to answer your last 1/3. I think, you know, the venue is, what's important for the venue is their venue. And, you know, what we're talking about here is how you can use Welshness to add something to the venue to drive a little bit more footfall, or to make that experience a bit better because you're using Welsh ingredients, or what you're doing if you're already using loads of Welsh ingredients, then highlighting it. And you know, so it's about adding value. It's not taking over. You know, if Welshness, if your venue is absolutely around local gastro, super all food, then it's all about that, isn't it? Whereas it may not be for other venues. So it's about understanding the role within that venue. And going back to your regional question, we haven't got a regional split, I don't think, within Wales, but I think you're right in saying that, you know, certainly in tourist areas where there are lots of English visitors, then the enhancement piece is even bigger. But it doesn't mean that Welsh people don't want it either. If you looked at all the other results, even the traditionalists, 7 out of 10, when they have more people likely to go to quick service restaurants or, you know, some more fast foodie type outlets, they still want more Welsh. So there's at the moment those venues have got hardly anything. So it's about moving the dial, really. And the last question about Welsh language, it was a yes/no question. And the question was more Welsh. So it wasn't saying you don't want less Welsh, it was more Welsh.
Yeah, and I think on sort of previous research, we did a lot of focus groups previously looking at the sort of use of Welsh language in branding. And I think there was quite a strong message from an English perspective that when Welsh done well and is accessible, and it doesn't feel as if English guests are excluded, it's really welcome because it adds authenticity and it makes people kind of feel more Welsh. But there was that balance in terms of making sure it was sort of accessible to English shoppers and similarly guests in this instance. So where it sort of is that balance in terms of the overall venue branding that Sophie was talking about.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Carrie. And I think, you know, and Harrod's point, that comes through very clearly in the value of Welshness 3 research, that people did not want to be excluded if they were non-Welsh speakers. They wanted to feel part of that cultural aspect. I think, Rhys, you had your hand up.
Yes, hi, good morning, everyone. Just a couple of points really on you know, in a world where local authority budgets are increasingly tight and getting tighter, you know, how do we get local authorities to spend more on, you know, obviously Welsh red meat is my interest, when you know they're being driven on cost, and you know, is it time for Welsh government to fund them better so that they can afford to make sure that it is Welsh meat on the menu in schools, hospitals, and so on?
That's a political question, really, isn't it, Rhys? I don't. I mean, you know, obviously, everybody would like to see more Welsh products on the menu, but I think that's a policy and political decision at a certain point. I don't know if anybody else wants to make a comment on that.
Well,
I think.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think it. You know, okay, it is political, but at the end of the day, we've got the Future Generations Wellbeing Act in place. You know, if that is being implemented, then all of the schools and anybody who purchases food using public funds should be purchasing local. So we have to make a decision at some point whether we're going to support it financially or not. And your survey said that taxpayers would be happy to pay more, or generally would be happy to pay more. So
happy.
Yeah. So where do we draw the line on it? Really, the decision has got to be made. Really.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there are some questions for policymakers to take away. And of course, those who are subject to the democratic process might be a bit more worried about things than, perhaps civil servants might be. And of course, civil servants are directed by the democratically elected. But I think one of the other things that came through in our earlier research was that Welsh isn't always more expensive. It's just sometimes people are not, they haven't even thought of it. And they may well be able to get local Welsh meat with a short supply chain for no more than buying from somewhere else. Now, that's obviously not always the case, but it can sometimes be the case. So I don't think we should make the assumption that Welsh is always more expensive. And certainly in our first research, which was in the retail sector, in terms of preference, would you like Welsh or non-Welsh? I'll have Welsh, please. Not everybody was prepared to pay more, but not everybody needed to pay more. And I think that's also a message. So I don't think we should have a takeaway from today that Welsh will necessarily be more expensive. And I think there'll be a lot of producers that would say, well, I can match, anybody's price, particularly when I've got local distribution.
Yeah, and I think I think the survey provides really strong evidence that the public is very supportive of having more Welsh food and drink in the public sector, and they see those benefits into the local economy, the circular economy arguments. And I think that the willingness to pay metric is just an indicator of where they the value that they place on that. It's not necessarily saying, oh, I will pay an extra amount of tax, all other things being equal, but it's saying I value those features enough for me to sort of put a figure on it. So I think it's useful evidence to show that the public are supportive of it.
Thank you, Rhys, for that. Have we got any further questions? We've got just a few minutes left.
Madeline said, to what extent would having Welsh in Wales contribute to the experience for, say, England, from England and Scotland? I'm assuming that's saying, I think that's about adding experiential value when you go into venues. Well, I think certainly that was one of the top 3 answers why people wanted more Welsh or English and Scottish visitors wanted more Welsh in venues, was they wanted it because it added more experience to their whole trip, and they thought that was quite useful. Is that what you were asking, Mervyn?
Yes, thank you, Sophie. I've got a dodgy connection, so that answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if we've got any more questions. There are no more on the chat, I don't think.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that point that certainly from the street survey, and this is exactly what you would expect in the more urban areas, Cardiff and Swansea, there was much less interest in Welshness, and as you move to the more tourist areas, that interest grew. But the survey is really drawing into this idea that people are coming to Wales and eating out in Wales and what they want. And okay, it's dominated by the English, but there were a few Scots in there, a bit like myself. And I think it's just that thing. We want to come away on holiday and for it to be a little bit different, a bit local, a bit cultural, but not that awful feeling of walking into the local pub and all the, everybody stops and turns around and looks at you in that kind of way, a sort of warm and welcoming sort of Celtic type welcome, I think.
I think it was also in looking at some of the detail of those survey results and kind of looking at the sort of the guest types that Sophie was talking about, the adventurer, the food lover, the traditionalists. And the reasons that people were giving for why they wanted to see more Welsh varied quite considerably between the different types. For instance, ethical eaters were really driven by the sort of link between Welshness, being more local, being more sustainable, being better for the environment, whereas food lovers were very sort of clear in their view that Welshness was an indicator of the venue quality. So, you know, Welshness means lots of different things to different people, and understanding how the guest type sort of sits with your venue type and the product on offer is quite interesting. And I think with you know, we saw the difference between the traditionalists and the other groups kind of scoring less in terms of Welshness, and looking at the detail of that. I think, you know, they scored much lower in all the questions that ask, you know, do you think it's better quality than GB? You know, and this difference between, you know, they were less likely to see any difference between Welsh and a standard GB offering. And the only place where they kind of saw Welsh adding value to their choice was in this link to the local economy and the sort of the farming community. So on all these different sort of guest types, there are sort of motivations for why Welsh adds value, which I think is really interesting, and hopefully we can pull out in some of the supporting information around this.
Yeah, and if we then present it to venues types or groups of or chains of venues, then obviously we'll be able to look at what's right for their venue and match that according to the different types of guests that we've got.
Okay. So any final questions? Our time is pretty much done. It's been fantastic to have you all with us on the presentation today. As I said earlier, sign up to the Insight Hub. Freely accesses anybody from Wales, Welsh businesses. You have free access to all of the Insight on the Insight Hub if you've signed up. This presentation will be uploaded in the next few days and will be available to you. And as always, we're happy to answer any questions informally. You've got Sophie, and if you want to take down Sophie's email address for any sort of queries, then we're more than happy to help you with those. Equally, through the clusters, you can get further information. So thank you all for being here today, and have a great rest of the week.